March 15th, 44 before the Common Era, the Theatre of Pompey in Rome. The most powerful man in the known world walks into what he thinks is just another Senate meeting. Within minutes, he'll be dead on the floor, stabbed 23 times by his own colleagues. Some of them are his friends. One of them he treated like a son. The assassination of Julius Caesar is probably the most famous political murder in human history. It's been dramatized in plays, painted on canvases, analyzed in countless history books. Shakespeare immortalized it with the phrase "et tu, Brute," but the real story is somehow even more dramatic than the fiction. Because this wasn't just a murder, it was a calculated attempt to save the Roman Republic that instead destroyed it forever. The conspirators thought they were heroes. History would remember them very differently. So how did it happen? Why did dozens of Rome's most important senators decide that killing Caesar was their only option? And what made them think they could get away with it? Let's dive into one of history's most consequential acts of political violence. To understand why Caesar had to die, at least from the conspirators' perspective, you need to understand just how powerful he'd become, and how unusual that was for Rome. Julius Caesar was born on July 12th or 13th, 100 before the Common Era, into the Julii family, an old aristocratic Roman house. They claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, which sounds impressive, but by Caesar's time, the family had more prestige than actual power or money. Caesar had to build his career through a combination of military brilliance, political savvy, and willingness to take risks that would have destroyed lesser men. His path to absolute power really kicked into gear in 59, before the Common Era, when he became consul. He formed a political alliance with Pompey the Great and Marcus Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. This first triumvirate wasn't official or even legal. It was just three powerful men agreeing to watch each other's backs, but it worked remarkably well for a while. After his consulship, Caesar got command of legions in Gaul, roughly modern France. What happened next was one of the most impressive military campaigns in ancient history. For 8 years, from 58 to 50 before the Common Era, Caesar conquered all of Gaul. His own writings claim 1 million Gauls died and another 1 million were enslaved. Modern historians approach these numbers with caution, recognizing that Caesar wrote his accounts partly as propaganda to glorify his achievements. Even if the real figures were lower, we're talking about conquest on a massive scale. Caesar became fabulously wealthy from war plunder and built a fiercely loyal army. But back in Rome, things were changing. The triumvirate fell apart. Crassus died fighting the Parthians in 53 before the Common Era. Pompey, once Caesar's ally and son-in-law, grew jealous of Caesar's success and drifted towards the Senate's conservative faction. By 49 before the Common Era, the Senate, with Pompey's backing, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. This would have left Caesar vulnerable to prosecution. Caesar faced a choice: obey the Senate and probably face exile or worse, or defy them and start a civil war. On January 10th, 49 before the Common Era, Caesar made his decision. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army. According to the historian Suetonius, he said, "The die is cast as he crossed. Civil war had begun." The war lasted until 45 before the Common Era, and Caesar won. He defeated Pompey's forces in Italy and Spain, then pursued Pompey to Greece, where he crushed the senatorial army at Pharsalus. Pompey fled to Egypt, where the Egyptians murdered him. Caesar followed to Egypt, got involved in Egyptian politics, had his famous affair with Cleopatra, and eventually returned to Rome victorious. Caesar was now Rome's sole ruler. He held the position of dictator, which in Rome was meant to be temporary. But Caesar kept getting his dictatorship renewed. Then in early 44, before the Common Era, the Senate declared him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. This was unprecedented and deeply threatening to republican traditions. Caesar didn't just sit on his power. He launched ambitious reforms. He reorganized the calendar, creating what we now call the Julian calendar. He expanded the Senate. He settled his veterans in colonies. He planned massive building projects. He put his own face on coins. He accepted honors that made him seem almost godlike. Some accounts describe him sitting on a golden throne while conducting business. And here's what really terrified the Senate. People loved him. The common citizens of Rome adored Caesar. He'd cancelled debts. He'd provided grain to the poor. He'd put on spectacular games. The masses didn't care about republican traditions, but to the senatorial class, Caesar looked like something Rome had fought against for 500 years, a king. The conspiracy to kill Caesar began in earnest in February of 44, before the Common Era. The two main leaders were Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Cassius was the driving force. He'd fought on Pompey's side in the civil war, but Caesar had pardoned him. Despite this mercy, Cassius never forgave Caesar for what he saw as the destruction of the Republic. Ancient sources paint Cassius as intense, lean, ambitious. He resented being passed over for honors he thought he deserved, suggesting personal grievance motivated him as much as political principle. Brutus is the more complicated figure. He was Caesar's protege and possibly even his illegitimate son, though most historians now reject this idea based on chronology. Caesar would have been only 15 years old when Brutus was born in 85 before the Common Era. Still, Caesar had a long affair with Brutus's mother, Servilia, and certainly treated Brutus like a son, promoting him, protecting him, grooming him for high office. Like Cassius, Brutus had fought for Pompey in the civil war, and like Cassius, Caesar pardoned him and brought him into his inner circle. But Brutus came from a family with a republican legacy. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had supposedly helped found the Republic by overthrowing Rome's last king 5 centuries earlier. According to historians, people started leaving messages around Rome reminding Brutus of his ancestors' example, asking whether he would save the Republic like his forefather had. On the evening of February 22nd, 44 before the Common Era, Cassius and Brutus met and agreed something had to be done. Then they started recruiting others. Their strategy was smart. They needed enough conspirators to overwhelm Caesar, but not so many that the secret would leak. They targeted senators around 40 years old, men in their prime, avoiding both reckless young men and elderly senators who might lack nerve. The conspiracy eventually grew to include about 60 senators. This wasn't a handful of extremists. This was a significant portion of Rome's political leadership deciding that murdering their leader was necessary. Some joined for ideological reasons. Others had personal grievances. Caesar had passed them over for promotions. He'd humiliated them. He'd made them feel powerless. One particularly important conspirator was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, not to be confused with Marcus Brutus. Decimus was actually a close friend of Caesar. His friendship with Caesar would prove crucial on the day of the assassination. The conspirators called themselves the Liberators. They genuinely believed they were saving Rome from tyranny, but they had a detailed plan for the murder itself and no plan for afterward. They apparently assumed that once Caesar was dead, everyone would celebrate and the Republic would be restored. They were catastrophically wrong. In the days before March 15th, Caesar was warned repeatedly that danger was coming. The question historians still debate is why he ignored those warnings. Ancient sources report numerous omens. An Etruscan prophet named Spurina warned Caesar to beware of great danger on or before the Ides of March. This became so famous that even today we say, "Beware the Ides of March." On February 15th, Spurinna examined a sacrificial bull and found it was missing its heart, considered a terrible omen. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had nightmares about her husband's death. The night before the assassination, she dreamed she was holding Caesar's murdered body. Another version described in ancient texts had Caesar's statue spouting blood like a fountain while Romans bathed their hands in it. When she woke, she begged Caesar not to go to the Senate that day. Whether all these omens actually happened or were invented later to dramatize the story, we can't know for sure. But Romans took omens seriously, and these would have been deeply unsettling. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar apparently considered staying home. Calpurnia's distress moved him. He sent word that he wouldn't attend the Senate meeting, but then Decimus Brutus arrived at the house. Decimus knew this was the day of the assassination because he was part of the conspiracy. He convinced Caesar that staying home would make him look weak and superstitious. The Senate was planning important business, Decimus said. If Caesar didn't show up, they might be offended. Caesar let himself be persuaded. As he left his house, according to some accounts, he encountered Spurinna on the street. Caesar supposedly joked, "The Ides of March have come," as if to say the predicted danger hadn't materialized. Spurinna replied, "Yes, but they have not yet gone." Why did Caesar ignore all these warnings? Maybe he was simply arrogant, unable to believe anyone would dare harm him. Maybe he was fatalistic, believing the gods determined when a man would die. Or maybe, as some historians suggest, he was exhausted by constant suspicion and security concerns. Perhaps part of him was tired of living like a target. We'll never really know. The Senate wasn't meeting in its usual location, but at the Theatre of Pompey. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Caesar was about to die in a building named for his old rival. Caesar arrived around 11 in the morning. The conspirators were already there, wound tight with nervous energy. As Caesar entered, a teacher named Artemidorus tried to hand him a note warning him about the plot. Caesar took it, but didn't read it, distracted by other people seeking his attention. The assassins had planned their approach carefully. They surrounded Caesar under the pretense of presenting a petition. Tilius Cimber asked Caesar to recall his brother from exile. When Caesar refused, Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it off his shoulder. In Roman society, this was a serious breach of etiquette, almost an assault. That was the signal. Publius Servilius Casca struck first, stabbing Caesar in the neck. It wasn't a killing blow. Caesar, who'd been a soldier his whole adult life, immediately reacted. According to Plutarch, Caesar grabbed Casca's arm and shouted, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Then all the conspirators rushed in with their daggers. This wasn't a clean execution. It was a frenzied mob attack. 23 stab wounds according to the sources. Caesar tried to fight back at first, but there were too many attackers. He was being stabbed repeatedly, blood soaking his toga. The senators who weren't part of the conspiracy fled in horror. And here's where we get to the most famous part. Did Caesar really say, "Et tu, Brute"? Those Latin words, meaning "you too, Brutus"? Shakespeare made them immortal. But ancient sources are conflicting. The historian Suetonius says Caesar shouted something when first stabbed, but then died in silence. Plutarch also says Caesar said nothing. However, both mention a tradition that Caesar said something to Brutus in Greek, kai su teknon, which translates to "you too, child," or "you too, my son." If Caesar actually said this Greek phrase, it would make sense. High-class Romans often spoke Greek to each other, but we can't know for certain what Caesar actually said, if anything. After being stabbed 23 times, most people probably can't manage eloquent final words. According to ancient accounts, when Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he stopped fighting. He pulled his toga over his head, either to die with dignity or simply because he'd given up. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. He was 55 years old. The entire attack probably lasted less than a minute. The greatest man in Rome was just a bloody corpse on the Senate floor. The conspirators stood there with their daggers covered in Caesar's blood. Marcus Brutus apparently tried to address the remaining senators, but they weren't sticking around. They ran from the building in panic. The Liberators had successfully killed Caesar. Now they had no idea what to do next. The assassins seemed to expect that once Caesar was dead, everyone would immediately understand they'd done the right thing. Instead, they discovered that Caesar was far more popular than they'd realized. The soldiers loved Caesar. He'd led them to victory after victory. To them, the senators hadn't liberated Rome. They'd murdered their beloved general. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal deputy, initially seemed to negotiate with the conspirators. The Senate worked out a compromise where the assassins wouldn't be prosecuted, but Caesar's acts would remain valid. It looked for a moment like Rome could avoid another civil war. Then came Caesar's funeral. Antony delivered a speech that turned public opinion violently against the conspirators. He held up Caesar's bloody toga. He read Caesar's will, which left money to every Roman citizen. The crowd went wild with grief and rage. They burned Caesar's body in the Forum. Then they rioted. Brutus, Cassius, and the others had to flee Rome for their lives. Meanwhile, a new player entered the game, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir. Just 18 years old when Caesar died, Octavian proved brilliant. He formed an alliance with Antony and Marcus Lepidus called the Second Triumvirate. Together, they launched a ruthless purge. Hundreds of senators and wealthy Romans were executed. In 42 BCE, Octavian and Antony's forces caught up with Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in northern Greece. The battle was savage. The Liberators lost. Rather than face capture, both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide. The conspiracy was finished, but the civil wars continued. Eventually, Octavian and Antony turned on each other. Octavian won. In 27 before the Common Era, the Senate gave him the title Augustus, and he became Rome's first emperor. The republic the conspirators had tried to save was gone forever, replaced by an empire that would last centuries. The supreme irony is that by killing Caesar, the conspirators accomplished the exact opposite of what they intended. They'd feared Caesar would end the republic. Instead, their assassination destroyed what remained of republican government. Caesar's heir completed what Caesar had begun, establishing the imperial system the conspirators had tried to prevent. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the Ides of March. The conspirators thought they'd save the republic. Instead, they destroyed it. You can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea. Caesar's vision survived him, and Rome became an empire anyway. If you enjoyed this dive into history's most famous assassination, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.